Hey y'all, so back with another Spotlight with Context, and today I am very happy to be talking about my 12th champion, Nico Minoru. So, getting right into it with the attributes, survivability of 3.5. In her base kit, Nico does not have a whole lot of explicit mechanics to reduce incoming damage, but she does have the ability to gain adrenaline outside of the normal ways, and she is better than anyone else at converting that back into health. And so that does turn into a fair amount of survivability. You have to be careful, but there is real sustain there. Damage of 4. She's not going to be winning races with Human Torch or Hitmonkey, but the damage is definitely there, and it climbs quite a bit if the opponent is trying to generate a lot of buffs. Ease of use of 3, as is somewhat a theme with my characters especially, but a lot of characters, you can kind of just run through the motions and get decent results here, right? You do your combos, you throw in a couple heavies, you go special 2, special 1, she'll work, right? But there is definitely an element of higher mastery here that mostly revolves around just how much you use the heavy attack and how you interact with the special 1 and its invisibility. Spoilers. We'll talk about both of those points when we get there. Then utility of 3.5. Nico has predominantly two big pieces of utility, but they are kind of a doozy, right? She has access to buff immunity. She's the second character with that. And she has access to Halt, which is still pretty new as well. As a reminder, that's basically the debuff form of Grit and allows you to hit into unstoppable characters as though they weren't. So before I move on, let's chat about buff immunity for a minute because I know that this is going to be a hot topic. I don't want to turn this entire video into a discussion on this, but I will just say, yes, we understand buff immunity is very strong, but we also can't really do anything about it or answer it elegantly or just flesh out the ecosystem around it as long as it only lives on one character. And that is realistically what it was until now, right? There were a few other uses. There's an anti-venom synergy, there's spots pre-fight, but realistically, as a weapon, this only existed on Claire. And that made it tricky to work with. Now it's on 2 people, you may see it again. From a design perspective, that's healthier. You can deal with effects better when there are more of them. Moving on for now to Defender Strength of 4. Nico is not necessarily built to be like, oh god, this is terrible, I'm going to die, but she does come with a fair number of wrinkles, right? And those wrinkles overlap in a way that very few champions answer all of them. And so you will probably have to either do some fancy things or use some characters that you are a little bit less comfortable with, or just wait out effects, which is obviously a problem in time-based modes, to deal with her. We'll kind of talk about those as we go. For the most part, there are answers to everything, but yeah, there are real threats here, which is why she's a 4. So, moving on to strengths and weaknesses, she has buff immunity, therefore buff control. I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. It's a really strong ability. The second one here, adrenaline manipulation. If you've not yet read my post on the updates to adrenaline on the forums, I recommend you give that a look. I will link it in the description. There's a number of things going on here, but for the most part, what you need to know is that we are now using adrenaline as an actual champion mechanic, and Nico is taking it significantly further than Cyclops. So a lot of her kit is built around adrenaline, and therefore she's good at using it. I also already mentioned her Halt. That makes her good against unstoppable opponents, and she's pretty good at keeping it up. Now, weaknesses, poison immunity, she can deal with this against cosmics, but against non-cosmics, poison immunity stops her pretty cold. And then a lot of her ability to run through her kit relies on bursts of power, and so ability power rate control shuts her down pretty efficiently. Additionally, if somebody is messing with her miss, then she's going to be both harder to use and easier to kill. So anti-miss is a big answer. Moving on to abilities, we're going to start with Blood Mage here. As a defender, Nico stores 40% of all damage taken as adrenaline. And I want to clarify, this is not the same thing as gaining normal adrenaline as an attacker. This does not count as combat adrenaline because it is not adrenaline being generated just by her being struck. This, again, pointing back to that post, if this is confusing you, I recommend you read that post. But this is ability adrenaline. That doesn't matter a ton right now, but if it ever does in the future and you're watching this back to try and figure out what's going on, that's the difference, right? This is an ability of hers creating this adrenaline whenever she takes any kind of damage. Hit damage, damage over time, bursts. She will create this adrenaline in response to incoming damage. And then while she has more than 5% adrenaline stored, she also gains an indefinite flourish passive. So a clarification here, 5% adrenaline, you can read that as the same amount as 5% health. This is compared to her total amount of max health, right? So, your bar would be full if you had 90% health and 10% adrenaline. Obviously, you can only take 90% of that with you for battleground scoring or something like that, but that is how we are counting this, still using the health bars total as 100. And then if you don't remember what Flourish does, that's going to increase both ability power and combat power rates. So generally she's going to get more specials and be more dangerous while she has a lot of this adrenaline stored from that incoming damage. Each time Nico gains a total of 5% of her max adrenaline, she gains a Fury passive for 15 seconds, and she can have up to 7 of these. So this is a cumulative tracker. It doesn't require her to gain 5% in a single burst. It's just every time that variable in the background crosses a multiple of 5, she's going to get a Fury. And because she's good at generating adrenaline, we'll get to the attacker side later, she's going to have access to these Furies. When Nico activates a special attack, she passively converts adrenaline to health per level of the special attack. She cannot convert more adrenaline than she has, and she cannot convert adrenaline above her own max health. Those might be obvious, but I'm saying them anyway. And then note that this is dependent on level of the special attack, so she will convert up to twice as much when she throws a special 2 as a special 1. Lastly, for this section, Nico starts each fight with 100% of the adrenaline she finished her previous fight in the same quest with, so it persists across fights. Again, this is not going to increase her score at the end of a Battlegrounds match, but it does mean that you start the next fight on a quest board with that adrenaline and therefore have opportunities to convert it. Personal Furies gained at this time gain 200% increased duration. So what that's telling you is that this start of the fight trigger does count as gaining adrenaline. And so if you end a fight with 20% of your health stored as adrenaline, you'll start the next fight with that 20%, and you will instantly gain 4 Furies that last for 45 seconds instead of 15. And so the most immediate thing this means is that you don't have to worry in a quest setting about not converting all of your adrenaline at the end of a fight. You will have future opportunities to do that. Moving on to Hex Girl. Nico's heavy charge and her third light attack place an indefinite Pinnacle buff on the opponent. This is a dummy buff, like Ignition or Loa's or anything else. It's just, more witchy. It's also quite pretty. But yeah, this is a dummy buff that she places on the opponent. If you remember the buff immunity earlier, you probably have an inkling of what's coming, but let's keep going. When the opponent gains a buff, Nico passively gains 2% of her max power, When one or more buffs are removed or prevented by immunity, she gains 3%. So that first trigger is very similar to how Kushala gains power when her opponent gains buffs. And then the second one is kind of similar to Claire's, except that it is just looking for buffs being removed or prevented by immunity. She is not gaining power on any other kinds of immunity. And then, again, as with Kushala, Nico does not benefit from the Mystic Dispersion Mastery directly. Instead, each rank increases the base potency of her personal power gains by 10%. So that means that 2% up above becomes 3, and the 3% becomes 4.5 if you are running 5 out of 5 Mystic Dispersion. Additionally, Nico gains 1% of missing health as adrenaline when a buff on the opponent is prevented or removed by immunity. This has a cooldown of 1 second, so that means that if you remove 5 or 6 buffs, you still only trigger this once, if that's happening in a single frame. But it does mean that if you are constantly preventing buffs from activating on your opponent with immunity, then you are going to see this adrenaline tick up. It's based on missing health, so if you're already healthy, this isn't going to be a lot, but this can be a big deal in buff-heavy matchups if your health has gotten low. And then lastly, in this section, Nico can inflict a buff immunity debuff for 11 seconds, refreshed when she casts any special attack. So once you get it up, as long as you can keep throwing specials, you can keep it up. You'll see where it comes from later on. As a defender, this is a passive instead of a debuff, and it does not apply if it is already active. So this next section is short. Staff of 1. Nico is magically bound to the Staff of 1. This is her own special family artifact. It can cast very potent spells, but the thing in the lore is that it can only cast those spells once. And so what we're doing with that is that each of these spells lasts until the opponent is defeated, kind of like House of X. It's not like Mr. Fantastic, where if you fail the fight, those are just gone. And it cannot be cast again within the same quest. So that means in Battlegrounds, you will always have access to these. But on a quest board like Alliance War or story content, once you use these pre-fights, they will not come back. Additionally, to answer questions that didn't necessarily need to be on the info page, but I'm sure people will ask, she is coded similarly to Human Torch, where a 5-star Nico cannot donate a pre-fight to a 7-star Nico. So, we mean the once per quest thing. A 7-star Nico could donate a pre-fight to another 7-star Nico, but at that point, that's fine. You're coordinating. And then as a defender, Nico will always cast Unworthy, which we'll get into in a second here with the spells. What Unworthy does is that it inflicts her personal buff immunity at the start of the fight. So that means if you want that buff immunity off you when you're attacking into a defending Nico, you're going to have to wait 11 seconds, and that can be tough. This also means that once per quest, you can have the buff immunity up immediately when you're attacking with her. Next up, Absorb. Nico gains a 55% Stimulate passive while blocking. Stimulate is the name we're using for increased combat adrenaline, and so this just means that instead of the base 30% damage stored from blocked hits, she will store 85%. And you could increase this to 90% if you were running the adrenaline stat focus, which is actually not a bad call for her. And so because she is so efficient at converting adrenaline back into health, this is similar to block regen like Kushala or Sorcerer Supreme have, but not quite the same thing. Next up, Ward. Nico can gain immunity to poison and rupture effects, again once per quest. And then Burn. Her poison effects are replaced by Incinerates, but deal 30% reduced damage. So, if you're facing somebody who's heavily resistant or immune to poison, and the trade for dealing Incinerates appeals to you, because those will be energy instead of direct damage, and you will no longer be countering healing the same way, so there are some downsides. You can make that trade so that you don't shut off completely, but you'll be dealing a bit less damage because of it. Moving on to her heavy attack, As an attacker, the first hit consumes 7% of her current health and stores it as adrenaline. So this just immediately means that that top 7% of your health bar is going to turn white and be adrenaline. This is not subject to ability accuracy reduction, you just get it, right? Now, I will immediately say, I know that we have had a history of champions consuming their own health not necessarily working out great, and that is something that we were very cognizant of in this development process. But I think you will find that because this is on the heavy, right, and thus is an avoidable trigger, and because it's current health and not max health, thus this hit gets smaller and smaller the more you use it, and because it's stored as adrenaline, which you have easy access to converting back when you use your specials, this does work out pretty well. And then note that as you are doing this, and as you are storing your health as adrenaline, that counts as gaining adrenaline, and so will give you the furies that we talked about earlier. And so you want to be doing a certain amount of this so that Nico hits as hard as she's supposed to. On the final hit, or when canceling this attack into a special 1 or 2, gain a Zeal passive for 6 seconds. That is a new type that prevents adrenaline decay, so that means that when you use the heavy and you trade in your health for adrenaline, you have a little bit of a safety net there of holding on to the adrenaline a bit longer before it starts to decay. As a reminder, whenever you gain adrenaline or convert it, it will pause decay for a little bit, so you can also look for those triggers as a way to hold on to this if you don't have the Zeal or if it runs out. Getting into her special attack. Special 1 on activation inflicts a halt passive for 13 seconds, and then this is refreshed when she casts any special attack. Does not apply if active. So the does not apply if active is kind of just telling you that the refresh happens, but a reapplication does not. But again, halt allows you to hit into unstoppable opponents, so as long as you can get to your special 1 before they go unstoppable, this is a pretty powerful tool. The final hit deals a significant burst of energy damage, which is increased by 20% for each damaging effect on the opponent, up to 10. That means this is tripled in strength when you have 10 damaging effects on the opponent. This can trigger through blocks, so be careful of it on defense. And as a defender, the total potency is reduced by 50%. So it does scale with her attack, which is important because she gains those Furies, right? But it is significantly weaker on defense, which is also important because it can get pretty sizable. And then after the final hit, Nico gains an invisibility passive for 4 seconds. If this causes an attack to miss, it goes on cooldown for 15 seconds. So you can disarm this and play around it. And if you use this on offense, such as against a stun immune opponent to get a safe heavy attack in, then it will go on cooldown, but it will come back. So it's powerful, but you have to be deliberate about how you capitalize on it. So Special 2, each hit inflicts a large poison debuff for 30 seconds. These are paused during the opponent's specials. And if a cosmic opponent is immune to any of Nico's poisons, including the ones that you hear later, she inflicts a matching acid burn instead. Acid burn, originally found on a Mortal Abomination, is basically the same as poison, but it is not subject to poison immunity. Now, one important point here, they have to be immune to it. If you're fighting somebody like Null who's just resistant to poison, this won't trigger. You're going to have to deal with the resistance. And this replacement does not apply to her incinerates. This is just for the poisons. And then the final hit inflicts her buff immunity. As a defender, this applies on activation, and as a reminder, will be a passive. So if you're not using the Unworthy pre-fight, this is where you get the buff immunity. You have to run to the Special 2 and apply it at the end. The Special 3 gains a bunch of attack for each damaging effect on the opponent, and the first time you use it, it ramps you and increases the duration of personal effects by 50% for the rest of the fight. So that is all of her effects. That's her Furies, her Zeal, her buff immunity, her halt, her poisons. This is just basically, oh, is the tempo of the fight getting in your way? Throw this and it's going to get easier. Now moving on to the signature ability here, whenever a buff or personal effect on the opponent other than a poison is prevented or removed by immunity, Nico inflicts a poison passive for 12 seconds. She can inflict up to 20 of these. And again, if a cosmic opponent's immune, then this will be an acid burn instead. The thing about these is that is not a lot of damage over 12 seconds. The tuning on these is honestly pretty similar to Onslaught's Neuroshocks. So these are likely not going to kill you on their own, but they definitely add up as chip damage, right? So you have to be careful of them, and they are damaging effects, so they will ramp up the burst damage on the special one. And as an attacker, that's their primary purpose, right? Is additional damaging effects to boost the special one. But on defense, you do have to watch for this, because it means that buff immunity on the attacker is not an answer. It is a weakness, right? Because that is her intent. She wants to make you immune to buffs and punish you for it. Unduped, she'll just gain more power, but duped, she will also try to poison you. Now, there are some buff immunes out there who are poison immune, but it is a relatively short list. Second bullet, personal effects on the opponent are paused during Nico's special attacks. So, this is going to apply to anything she puts on the opponent, her buff immunity, her halt, and also her poisons. And then when Nico causes an attack to miss, she gains adrenaline. This is not based on missing health. This is just a lump sum of adrenaline. This has a cooldown of half a second, so it's not going to go insane against Quicksilver, but this can be significant, right? And this kind of introduces a bit more of a choice around the miss on the special one, because as an attacker, you can use that invisibility to gain adrenaline and to effectively heal yourself. But doing so is going to activate the cooldown, right? And as a defender, you can put that invisibility on cooldown, but when you do so, you're going to be giving her some adrenaline, which she is probably going to convert back. Moving on to synergies, first up we have Love Brighter Than the Sun with Carolina Dean. This gives Nico a new pre-fight. It will also only work once per quest, but when the opponent finishes a special attack, Nico power steals 80% of their remaining power over 2 seconds and gains half of what she steals. So this is similar to Purgatory's Mutant pre-fight. Not quite as strong, but a very nice piece of power control. This is a solo synergy, so it only affects Nico, but that is because Carolina's benefit lives on Carolina, and you can see that tomorrow with the next video. Next up we have Sisters of the Abbey with Magic, Scarlet Witch, and the Sigil version of Scarlet Witch. This also gives Nico another pre-fight. This one just consumes 30% of her current health at the start of the fight and stores it as adrenaline. So that is a little bit of a risk because you are literally starting with less health, but you are also starting with a bunch of adrenaline, meaning that you can start with a bunch of Furies, and as a reminder, Furies gained right at the start of the fight like this last longer. So you can use this to hit really hard if you're trying to nuke something down. For Magics and Scarlet Witches, they gain a 30% stimulate passive while blocking, so they're going to gain significantly more adrenaline while blocking. It's not going to be as much as Nico's Absorb pre-fight, but it is going to give them some more sustain. West Coast, Best Coast with Kate Bishop, She-Hulk, Werewolf by Night, and Tigra. Synergy champions pause Hunter and Primal Senses, and up to 5 personal tracking, Fury, Unblockable, or Halt effects during the opponent's special attacks. So Tigra's senses get a bit better, Kate Bishop has a bit better uptime on her tracking, Werewolf holds on to his Unblockable a bit longer, She-Hulk gets to pause some of her Furies, not all of them, thankfully, and then Nico also gets to hold on to her pause a bit easier. So just maintenance for all of them, right? And then lastly, we have Pride with Hercules, Loki, Captain Britain, Black Cat, and a coming soon character. As with previous Pride champions, all champions gain 90 armor rating, block proficiency, energy resist, and physical resist. But this section right here is something that we've been experimenting with a little bit, just like a very quick summary of the character overall. You have a quick run through their loop. This is going to be easier for some characters than for others. And I am going to be that person and say you should always take these how to plays, or whatever term we end up going with them, with a grain of salt, right? Every character is more nuanced than the quick loop someone is going to give you. But I also know that if I don't give you this quick loop here, you're going to take somebody else's quick loop. Sorry, some of you are going to take somebody else's quick loop and go with that. So might as well give it to you here, and I'm just going to encourage you to experiment beyond this, right? Our game is more complex than this. 3 bullet points don't really cover it, but hopefully this is a nice starting point, right? You parry heavy to build power, convert adrenaline, and place pinnacle buffs. You throw the special 2 to get poisons and to apply buff immunity, which if she's duped is going to give you more poisons. Then you throw the special 1 to deal burst damage based on poisons. That's kind of Nico in a nutshell, and then you build out from there. And then the second section is more defense-oriented. These are her major threats. She inflicts buff immunity on start, and with her special 2, she gains power and inflicts poison when duped. When the attacker's immune to buffs, she places a buff when charging heavy, so you have to be careful baiting out heavies. She causes miss after her special 1, and she gains adrenaline both on that miss when duped and when you are immune to buffs. And then she converts that adrenaline back into health on her specials. So those are kind of the core threats, right? Not telling you how to answer them. There's individual answers to every one of those lines pretty much. But those are kind of the things to really focus on when you're picking a counter. Think about, how can I at least mitigate most of these, maybe by answering some outright so that lets me play around the others, right? There's going to be a balance, but these are kind of the major threats. So look forward to seeing some more of this in the future, but let me know in the comments how you feel about this. Obviously, if you are here and you've listened this long, then you have some capacity for listening to longer breakdowns of champions, but what did this do for you? Did this help coalesce things that we'd talked about this whole time? How much would you use this going forward versus the deeper breakdowns? I do want your honest feedback, right? I'm not really worried about being put out of a job, so to speak, because these videos don't really make me a lot of money anyway. So I do want the feedback. How would you react to these going forward? And yeah, that is Nico. I'm really happy with her. I've wanted to play with adrenaline for a while now, honestly. It's an old enough mechanic that we kind of had to figure out how it was going to work in different classes and integrate with the rest of the game before we could really dive into it, but I'm really happy with how it played out here. Huge shout out to our gameplay engineering team for delivering all of these fun toys to play with in design. I really think it brought her to life. I love how it works with the Blood Mage flavor of her lore abilities. Yeah, I'm really happy with this character, as is probably incredibly clear. But yeah, let me know what you're thinking. Happy to answer some questions and chat in the comments. And until next time, thank you so much for watching, and take care.